Did you know that it was the child who drew the next target? You may not have heard of this Mafia incident, because at the time the media didn't really cover it too much. It was one of those incidents that just got buried. And to be honest, if you did have a direct connection to the case, or were living in the area where it happened, then you probably wouldn't even know about it. But nevertheless, the story is still insane. So let's go over what happened in detail. So this all went down in Kansas City back in 2017. Two members of the Mafia were in the middle of a meeting with a confidential informant working for the FBI, when suddenly an unknown gunman opened fire on their location, killing one of the mobsters and critically injuring another. This event took place inside of a Pizza Hut parking lot of all places. Just imagine you sitting there eating pizza with your friends, and the next thing you know, bullets start flying everywhere. But here's where things get weird. One of the people who was shot was actually an undercover FBI informant named William Ogation. He was shot in the head but survived the attack. And the person who was killed was a made member of the Mafia named Nicholas D'Angelo. In fact, Angelo had been a made member since 1980, which means he had been involved in some capacity with the Mafia for close to 4 decades. After being indicted by a federal grand jury on drug trafficking charges, Angelo decided to cooperate with the feds in hopes of getting a reduced sentence. At the time of the shooting, he was cooperating with the FBI in regards to an ongoing extortion and arson investigation. And just so you understand how deep this guy went with the Mafia, he was heavily involved with the Genovese crime family. In fact, he was such a big fish that the feds even labeled him a captain within the organization. Angelo also had ties to the Bonanno crime family. On the day of the shooting, Angelo, along with another Mafia member named John Edward Rubez, and FBI informant William Negrelli, were meeting with a confidential informant in a car in the parking lot of a Pizza Hut in the 9600 block of Wernal Road in Kansas City. During this meeting, an unknown suspect walked up to the car and opened fire multiple times before fleeing the scene. Witnesses say they saw a black SUV speeding away from the scene immediately after the shooting. What makes this case so confusing is that it was the confidential informant who called the shots, if you know what I mean. He was the one who basically put out the hit on Angelo. To make matters even more confusing, the motive for the murder remains unclear. With the facts surrounding the case, investigators can only speculate about why the informant would betray these men. The first theory is that he simply wanted to protect himself. If the informant was exposed and his identity was known, he could have easily feared for his life and decided to take matters into his own hands. After all, there are no good informants, only necessary informants. In other words, the end goal is always the same. Once the feds get the intel they need from these informants, they discard them like yesterday's news. They become liabilities and are often targets for retaliation attacks. It's dirty work. In a court document filed in 2018, prosecutors stated that both the surviving victim and the deceased victim had been working as confidential informants for the FBI. They also said that the informant who pulled the trigger was not authorized to kill Angelo or Negrelli. However, they did acknowledge the possibility that the informant acted in self-defense, citing the fact that the informant has received numerous death threats in the past. The filing read, "To date, the government does not have evidence establishing a motive for the shooting or any evidence." Directly linking the defendant to the shooting, it's possible that the confidential informant believed that he was being followed after the meeting, and that he was under the impression that someone was trying to kill him. Angelo had also been released from federal prison just 5 months before the shooting. He was serving time for a 2014 drug conviction and got out early for good behavior. But just because he was released doesn't mean he stopped working with the feds. There's a possibility that the confidential informant thought that Angelo was looking for him because he wanted revenge for being ratted out. Maybe he felt that Angelo wasn't taking his safety seriously enough, or maybe he was just paranoid. We don't know. What we do know is that the confidential informant turned himself into the police shortly after the shooting. He was interviewed by investigators at an undisclosed location. According to the documents, the informant told authorities that he had recently moved to a new house and that he thought someone was following him. He denied, however, having anything to do with the shooting, said he didn't know who would want to harm the 2 victims, and claimed that he didn't own a gun. Despite his claims, the gun used in the shooting was later found in a vehicle belonging to the informant. Additionally, the informant had recently purchased ammunition that was the same type used in the shooting. This obviously doesn't prove that he was the shooter, but it certainly seems like the feds had a pretty solid case against him. In fact, there was even a witness who came forward and said that they saw the informant buying those very same bullets. Another detail that investigators revealed was that the informant had accessed Angelo's bank account 3 days before the murder. What would you have to hide, right? Well, according to the feds, the informant tried to withdraw $3,000 from Angelo's bank account 3 days before the murder, but was denied because he didn't have proper identification. Angelo's attorney general was listed as the registered owner of the black SUV that was seen speeding from the scene. Now here's the thing. All of the evidence pointed to the informant. It was almost an open and shut case. But as soon as he gave his statement, everything changed. The FBI seemed to drop all interest in him as a suspect and started focusing on another Mafia member named Joseph A. But here's where the story gets really weird. During the investigation, the feds tapped the phones of several Mafia members. One of them was an associate of Angelo's who was identified only as Paul. On April 12, 2017, an FBI agent listened to Paul talking on the phone. He was in a hotel room with somebody saying, "You weren't supposed to shoot him right there. That was the stupidest thing you could have done. You shot him right outside in front of everybody." After hearing this, the agent searched Paul's trash and found a drawing of a Pizza Hut parking lot. The agent then searched Paul's motel room and found a pair of shoes that matched impressions left at the scene of the crime. At this point, it seemed obvious that Paul was the shooter, right? But when the feds confronted him, he denied everything. He didn't confess or even offer up an explanation for his innocence. He just straight up denied it. On June 7, 2017, Paul was charged with racketeering and illegal possession of a firearm. But the feds failed to charge him with murder, which was odd considering all the evidence stacked against him. Around the same time, the informant who testified against Paul was arrested and charged with illegal possession of a gun. Now, you may be wondering why the feds would charge Paul with illegal possession of a firearm and illegal possession of a firearm. Sounds like double jeopardy. Well, they weren't charging him twice for the same crime. Remember, illegal possession of a firearm is a separate crime from the murder itself. The feds were charging Paul with illegal possession of a firearm because he was a convicted felon. Felons are prohibited from possessing firearms. You may be thinking that the feds probably dropped the charges against Paul because he offered up a good alibi. But that wasn't the case either. Paul pleaded guilty to illegal possession of a firearm in March of 2018 and was sentenced to 27 months in prison. And during his trial, the feds never once mentioned the Pizza Hut murder. Then in January of 2019, the charges against the informant were unexpectedly dropped. Prosecutors didn't say why they dropped the charges. It seems like they were able to build a strong enough case to convict Paul. The feds didn't pursue the informant because they knew he would have given them everything they needed. He basically admitted to the crime. Why bother putting him through a lengthy trial when he's already confessed? And let's face it, the feds don't really need confessions. They just need evidence. And they already had enough on Paul to nail him to the wall. As for Angelo, he was laid to rest in his hometown of Niagara, New York. His funeral was held at St. Joseph's Church, which was attended by hundreds of mourners. His obituary described him as a loving husband, father, and brother who had a passion for golf, horses, and especially his grandchildren. It made no mention of his involvement with organized crime. As for the FBI informant, well, we don't know what happened to him. Confidential informants are kept under tight wraps for obvious reasons. They're literally in witness protection, so we don't know what happened to him, but the feds likely paid him handsomely for his cooperation. Let's just hope he spent that money wisely. Was the confidential informant just protecting himself? Or was he a cold-blooded killer? Let me know in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching.